Hi, everybody. I am so excited for this cozy fantasy panel, and I already know that of all the panels I've done this year, my mom is the most excited for this panel as well. It's me and my mom. We're both really excited for this panel. Um, I am really happy to be chatting with all of these amazing books. Just a little bit about me. If you didn't know, I'm the moderator for the panel. My name's Lily, and I'm kind of the internet face behind Utopia State of Mind. I'm going to have everyone now introduce themselves and tell us about their books before we jump into the questions that I have. So, Sangu, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hi. And hi, Lily's mum. Um, I'm Sangu. I'm the author of The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches and the upcoming A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping. Both titles are quite a mouthful, but I get to the end eventually. They're both cozy fantasies. They're quite different, but I think they both have a common theme of a witch in her 30s is sort of trying to find her place in the world, even if that place physically is already kind of set in stone. In Irregular Witches, the main character is Mika, and she is a very lonely, sort of isolated witch who becomes effectively Mary Poppins to three young witches and finds the family she never had. And in A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping, Sarah, the main character, was once a really powerful witch, and she's lost her magic and wants it back, and maybe discovers that other things might be more important along the way. Maybe, I don't know.
Is it my turn? Okay, sorry. I'm Megan Bannon. I'm the Sangu. I'm on team long, complicated titles. I love yours. So I'm the author of The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, and coming out on Tuesday, The Undermining of Twyla and Frank. Very excited about. And I basically write your standard romantic comedy, but in a bonkers, quasi Wild West fantasy world where talking animals deliver the mail.
I'm literally I'm vibrating right now because my instinct is to be like, it's so good. Like, I want to talk about it, but I'm like, no, the author's here. She can talk about it.
I would actually prefer it if you would. That would be way more fun.
Wait, are you from the Wild West? Or because I'm in Arizona. Like, are you actually out here?
Yeah. No, well, I'm from Kansas, so I'm kind of
okay. So still kind of west,
west-ish.
Yeah. Okay. I got excited. I was like, oh my god, is there another Arizonan? Because that happened to me on a panel just a couple weeks ago. Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, everyone should read Megan's books. I love them.
Oh, my turn. Hi, I'm Natalia Hernandez. I write Latin fantasy novels, and my cozy book is called Asiri and the Amaru. It is based on Peruvian mythology, and it is set in a reimagined Incan empire. The young woman, Asiri, has a gift. She has the ability to speak to animals, but when her powers are being abused in her home, she decides to escape and live like a normal life in this cute coastal village. But that proves difficult because her paths keep crossing with this charming, handsome animal healer guy, who's the person most likely to guess her secret. And through a twist of fate, they stumble across an injured Amaru, who is a creature from mythology that no one expected to be real. And now they have to protect the creature, save it from the ignorant townspeople, and try not to fall in love while doing so. We'll see how that goes.
I'm Rebecca Thorne. I just had my book re-released traditionally, but I was originally indie. It is called Can't Spell Treason Without Tea, and it follows two intensely dangerous women who leave their fantasy lives and careers and go and open up a bookshop that serves tea. So it's very much like, if you like Legends and Lattes, I wrote it kind of to just go right along with that. But it is the start of a quartet. So the second book is coming out in October, called A Pirate's Life for Tea. And all 4 books will actually be out by next August, which is wildly fast for traditional publishing. But it follows the same set of characters throughout. So if you like Tamara Pierce's quartets, it's literally just in the same vein as that. So
I love Tamara Pierce's quartets.
I feel like she's such a queen, and I just want I've always wanted to write something that could fit alongside her stuff on a shelf. So very pleased to get the opportunity.
One of the few series that I still have in paperback on my shelves from, like, I don't even know how many years it's been, but those books have never left my shelf. Speaking of which, it's my turn. I'm Olivia Atwater. I wrote the Regency fairy tales, starting with Half a Soul. I also have out a few craft books, as well as Small Miracles, which is a kind of Good Omens-esque cozy fantasy. And I've just started the Victorian fairy tales, which are, I don't know that I would call those cozy. they're like cozy gothic, which isn't, there's more blood.
I'd call them awesome.
Yeah, that's what I got. I'm as I always end up saying at these panels, I count my coffees. I'm at 1.5 coffees in, so that's about where my awareness is at. I'm still in the ask me questions and I'll answer them, and eventually I'll get a brain.
I would kill for the 0.5 coffee. I'm only down to 1 at this point, so
It's a tragedy.
I'm still stuck on cozy gothic because I feel like that could be a real thing. I like that.
So funny enough, I had a discussion with a bunch of other authors in the space, and we were like, what is a cozy gothic? How can you have a cozy gothic? And we had an argument over it, and we were like, okay. So we think the definition of a cozy gothic is just, it's a gothic, but it has a layer of removal to it, and it can be anything. It can be humor. It can be like having a stiff cup of tea while there's blood on the walls. Like, it's just, you just have to have something, some extra layer of removal there that makes it a little bit more palatable.
I honestly am so there for that idea of just having a cup of tea while there's just like blood smeared on the walls, and they're just like, we don't have the time or space to deal with this right now.
I personally enjoy the whole, my approach to it was, I have a heroine who's like very genre savvy, basically, who's like, yes, I know you're writing bloody messages for me, and that's very nice and very good for you, but I'm a little bit busy right now and I'll get back to it later, okay?
Yeah.
That's a perfect segue, because one of the questions that I had, obviously, since we're talking about cozy fantasy, is for each of you how you kind of conceptualize this, and in specifically kind of the intersections between fantasy, romance, cozy, what it means to be cozy. So yeah, I'd love to hear from all of you kind of what it means, or how you envision that and in your book specifically. Olivia, do you want to start? Because you were talking a little bit about your cozy gothics, and I'm so excited for that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I can just expand on what I was just talking about. So yeah, we basically came down to, after a long discussion, we just came down to, like, cozy, at the end of the day, it just needs to be something that has an extra layer of removal from anything upsetting. So it doesn't mean you can't have anything upsetting. It just means that, like, you have something about the tone or the setting or whatever that softens the blow a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think I actually really like that as a definition. And I actually like it as a literary technique, because it allows you to talk about very serious subjects that normally people would find too upsetting to talk about. But as long as you have kind of layered something else in there, it just makes it easier. And it doesn't leave people feeling wrung out after they've read the book. And I think that and that's something that I've heard a lot, is because, in Half a Soul, which was the first Regency fairy tale, talking about things like workhouses, which were just awful. For anyone who doesn't know, workhouses or poorhouses, a previous version of them, is the idea of poor people being essentially imprisoned in these houses and then forced to do menial labor. And they tear families apart. The labor's so bad that people get sick, they die. It was workhouses were very, very nasty, and they're all throughout, English history, but we have versions of them I would say, in lots of different countries, lots of different eras. But one of the things that keeps coming up over and over when I talk to people about the books and about the featuring the workhouses and stuff is that they were like, yeah, it was really serious stuff and very heavy stuff, but somehow I reached the end of the book and I was like, I feel nice. I'm thinking about it, but I still feel nice.
Did anybody watch Hazbin Hotel recently?
Yeah.
I don't know how they did it, but that was somehow cozy to me. And I'm like, that was a lot of topics that should not have been cozy, but
I think it's that found family thing,
I think
isn't it?
I really do think it's found, and the fact that like they have a safe space to come back home to.
Yeah.
You know, like the hotel becomes their safe space over the course of that
I
series.
feel like, yeah, like I feel like for
Mhm.
me, that is a huge part of it. Like found family. And yes, like that safe base to come back to that is, I mean, it may be threatened, but it's never actually, there's no danger it's ever actually going to be lost.
Right. Like
And
there's nothing that comes through their door that they can't handle at that
Right.
hotel, you know?
And like I also think that, I mean, you know, we can talk about like high stakes and low stakes and medium stakes until the cows come home, and it's been a debate for like ever since we started using the term cozy fantasy. But I think that for me personally, it's, you know how there's often like in standard fantasy, you're like, oh, I would love to like go there or be in that world, but I wouldn't want to be doing any of those things. I feel like the thing that makes a cozy fantasy cozy is that you would want to embody that whole world. You'd want to be with those people, do the sorts of things they're doing, live in that world, and you don't have any of the stress.
Yeah.
There might be adventure, there might be like, you know, stuff happening, but at no point do you feel stressed out.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why we love fantasy so much, is the adventure, is like the all the fantastical elements that go into it. But yet sometimes there's a little bit too much danger and blood and risk of death. Like I know me, I would love to go to a fantasy world. And I've joked about this before, but like my cracking knees would certainly give me away in a high, like danger situation. And you know, so like that, I think that's the thing about cozy fantasy, is that you're right, there is still adventure and there is still obstacles and things might get difficult, but there's a sense of, even though you can feel all that on the surface, deep down you know it's going to be okay. And it's sort of like a slice of life moment, but with these beautiful fantasy elements that we love in other my higher stakes books.
Yeah.
I think I really liked, I think that's such a good point, what you said about how we sort of like, there might be big dangerous things happening, and sometimes the fantasy part gets just a little too much, and you as the individual reader might feel like, I mean, I'm neurodivergent. My husband is neurodivergent. Our 3 children are neurodivergent. Explain to me how any of us would survive the zombie apocalypse. I have at least one child who would give us away.
It's because you're neurodivergent that you would.
And that's what I think, like, some fantasies would go that route, would be like, oh, because you're different, you would excel in this world. But I also feel
I
like
mean, it depends on the neurodivergence, but I feel like my ADHD would probably be very good in a zombie apocalypse.
I mean, mine might, but I also feel like my son's autism would like not. And I feel like one of the things about cozy fantasy is that it feels like anyone of any sort of person can thrive in that world.
Yeah.
And
Well, and that's what I like about this kind of the rise of the genre. Because I mean, and I actually have written a zombie apocalypse kind of, because that's what Heart and Mercy is. And like, I think for me, like the trick is that it's very, most secondary world fantasy deals with like kings and queens and big epic battles of right and wrong. And I'm really interested in like just the average everyday person inhabiting the world in a real body. Just kind of getting by, like, and this is just normal, right? Like, I remember going to see Jasper Ford talk a long time ago about the Thursday Next series and how he pulls it off, because it's bonkers. But like the people, it works because for the people in the world, this is reality. Yes, an owl delivers my mail and talks to me every day. Of course, you know, yeah, we have an undead problem. it's kind of like, oh, there's ants in the kitchen. I mean, it's that kind of thing. These are just normal people trying to get through every day. And I think that's part of what makes it cozy, because it becomes like really relatable. It's like, oh yeah, man, those zombies are a problem.
I really love that, like an undead problem like ants. Like that's such a great description of that book.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably pretty true in cozy fantasy for sure. I think that it is very like when like there's higher stakes, like my book has higher stakes just because I really love beating my characters to shit and then just like fixing them, right? Like I'm just like, oh no, you're like bleeding and almost died. Like let's bring you in and give you a cup of tea, and your partner will wrap you up in a cozy cocoon by the fire and like we'll take care of you, and like that's my vibe of cozy. So I feel like for, with that, what I've heard from the readers is like the reason it makes them feel okay is because even if something dramatic happens on one page, they know that, 3 pages down the road, it will be fine. Like you can take a breath, like they will not die. Even if it seems like they might, they won't die. Like there's not going to be a problem there. And I think that kind of like cozy comfort is something wonderful that a lot of readers need right now.
And I think that's another thing is that in cozies, the characters are usually pretty good to each other. Like not always, not all the time, not everyone, but like overall, you've got people really good to each other. Not necessarily nice, but they're good to each other. And that's something that you don't necessarily get in high fantasy, like in other types of fantasy. You can get some real assholes. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
And that's
wanting to overthrow you in cozy.
And I like that. I think that makes me feel that sense of coziness too. Is like, oh, people are good to each other. That's nice.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remind people, if you have any questions during the chat, please put them in the live chat or like the chat box, basically, and I'll try to go through them at various points at the end. The next question that I have is kind of related to a little bit of what Natalia said, which is kind of what is the first adult fantasy romance that you read? Like, what's the sort of the touch point for how you sort of envision your sort of reading journey in that sense? And then how do you think the concept of that has changed since then for you now, I guess, which is like, we're starting with the really small, really easy questions first before we get into anything else.
So funny enough, I think if I were going to say like the first fantasy romance that I ever read, like I guess if I got pushed on it, I would be like Howl's Moving Castle. But really, like it's not, the book is really
not like the movie.
Yeah, no. Well, and I was also going to say, like, as much as there is a romance in there, I don't, and as important as it is in some respects to the story, it didn't really overtake the story very much. But I would say the first like really romance that I guess impacted my writing was C.E. Murphy's Urban Shaman series, which I would categorize as like paranormal romance, but we didn't really always have a fantasy romance genre per se. So I feel like in some respects, like fantasy romance has drawn a little bit from paranormal romance, at least from a similar crowd of readers. And like, I'm certainly an example of that. Like I was huge into paranormal romance. It got me through grad school. So I think I would probably say that was the series that really like got me thinking about romance with fantasy aspects, which is probably why the longer I write, the more I end up with more plot and less romance. I get sidetracked from the romance. I'm like, I mean, I like romance. I love romance. It's very squishy when it does happen, but then I'm like, plot.
I feel like I could go on for hours about romantasy and
I
why.
was about to say,
Literally, like I feel like I could talk for hours about my theories.
I feel like what we've started to call romantasy, like the very sort of typical definition now, is just rebranded paranormal romance.
It literally has been around forever. It's been around since the beginning.
And that's not a bad thing. Paranormal romance is great.
Right.
I mean, it didn't need a new name, but it's great.
I think there was just a slight shift, and I think the slight shift was that there's more secondary world and less urban now. Like that,
Yes.
but that's the only
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
see it being very different apart from that.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Well,
absolutely true.
And for me, like, I'm always really interested in like the psychology behind why certain trends become things. So like obviously cozy fantasy in my brain came from the pandemic because we all got so stressed that all we wanted was something to forget our worries, right? I like slightly darker here, some trigger warnings for domestic abuse, but I kind of think that the pandemic in the darker sense is also why romantasy became a thing right after it. Because I feel like a lot of people were trapped in houses with partners that maybe did not end up being who they were hoping they would be, or they were trapped with abusers and they couldn't get out. So they wanted the protector figure, the person who loves them to death and will protect them from harm in any way possible. And I feel like those themes I'm seeing a lot of in romantasy these days, like that, like alpha male comes in and is like, I will make sure that you're safe, like don't harm her, don't put your hands on her. And I feel like I'm seeing a lot of that in romantasy. And in my brain, it all directly relates to the rise of that type of thing over the pandemic. Sorry, that got dark. I think about trends a lot.
I do think that like the alpha sort of man figure, usually of a paranormal persuasion, has sort of been a staple of romantic fantasy / paranormal romance for like decades. Like I think my first one was Nalini Singh's Slave to Sensation, which is the first Psy-Changeling a book. I think it's the first one. There are so many. It is so good. But I think that's the first one. And that is very much like it's sort of built around that concept. And yes, it's urban. Like you said, Olivia, it's a lot. Like I think a lot of the first fantasy romances I read were very sort of urban fantasy based. But yeah, and I feel like that, that protective figure, the sort of it's a sort of thing that in real life we would side eye as this is there are red flags all over.
Yeah, no, like red flags everywhere. Super
But
toxic.
in fiction, it's how we sort of indulge that kind of
One of the
fantasy in a safe
universal
way.
fantasies. Yeah.
I think a big distinction for that is when we read, we can hear, we know what they're thinking, what that character's thinking, what the person on the receiving end is thinking, how they're feeling. So there is, at least we as the reader understand the consent behind it, despite it not maybe being vocalized all the time. So there's a safety in that because we as the reader know the motivations of the characters, but in real life it would that would not.
And it's interesting that we should bring up like that whole alpha male thing though, because so I'll preface this by saying that I am a huge proponent of everybody reads what they want, and I think everybody should enjoy what they enjoy, and I don't like shaming people for it. Me personally, I actually cannot read alpha male stuff. It really throws me and discomforts me, and I just literally cannot do it. I get very uncomfortable, which I actually really like the fact that with cozy romance, we're seeing a lot more of kind of like caregiver stereotypes.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Which is something I've always been craving a lot from my romances, because I feel like I have to endure alpha males sometimes when I'm enjoying everything else about the story. But like I said, like I'm not going to say it triggers me, because it's definitely not to that extent. It's just extremely uncomfortable for me, and I can't deal with it.
Yeah.
When I was writing a CD, I had this moment of doubt. I mean, I was still going to write the book that I wanted to write, but my male MC is very much like a golden retriever, cinnamon roll type guy. Like he's baby girl, and I was like, oof, I don't know if the readers are going to respond to this. This is a very sweet boy. And luckily, they ate it right up. But I had that moment because of this rise in, or at least if it's not the rise of the alpha male, it's definitely more talked about now with things like Book Talk and BookTube and all that. So I did have a moment of like, ooh, I don't know how he's going to come across, but
yeah.
You have just completely sold your book to me. I'm going to like bring it up right now and buy it as soon as we're done.
I do love that in general. One of the other things about cozy fantasy, like you said, is that we get to see the softness and gentleness of men
Yeah.
in a way that so much fantasy, so much fiction sort of glosses over. And it's nice. It's nice to see masculinity portrayed in a way that's not overbearing, not
Mhm.
toxic. That these are men that that we know in our real lives, our brothers, and
Yeah.
and like, oh no, the soapbox is coming.
I knew it would happen.
Like, I mean, I should be laughing. Like, we live in a world right now where it is considered acceptable to murder unarmed men because they're men, they're not women and children. And I feel like a lot of that comes from this idea that there is an inherent lack of gentleness in men. And this is not to say that there are not many, many, many men who are not gentle, but I also feel like we've glossed over for a long time that the capacity for goodness and gentleness, which has led to real life dehumanization, and it sucks.
Yeah.
I had a great discussion with someone the other day about how masculinity doesn't need to be toxic. It can still be positive masculinity. And I was like, yeah, it's really the difference between punching up and punching down. If you're a guy and you are angry about injustice, that's very hot. I'm sorry. Like I'm attracted to that. Go punch a CEO. I will be all over that. It's the getting angry and blowing up at less powerful people that really distinguishes it. And so I'm always also up for like positive masculinity as well. I'm okay with that. I can get behind that every day.
Megan, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Okay, well, as I'm listening, I don't know. Like,
I know you seem like you're like enjoying the conversation.
I'm having a good time. I guess I'll go on the soapbox. Like my life's complete. It's funny because I know we started talking about like what was your first romantasy that you read, and I kind of like everything I've come to in life, I came to circuitously. So like I was a children's librarian for 20 years, and I read children's books. And I felt like I was cheating if I read an adult book because, so that was always like a special treat for vacation because like my job was to like be able to read and recommend books written for people ages 0 to 18. And so like my romantic touch points are all like young adult. I keep thinking of, well, like Howl's Moving Castle I read when I was actually like 13 or 14 and it changed me. And then like as a librarian, I remember some of those books that I really enjoyed reading and enjoyed recommending to kids. Specifically, do you guys remember Sorcery and Cecilia, the Magic Chocolate Pot book? Anybody? Yeah. Oh my God. It's glorious. Glorious. It's like, it's kind of got a Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell kind of feel to it, And of course, then when I read an adult book, I go for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or what's that really great Zen Cho book that came out? Like,
The Sorcerer to the Crown.
Yeah, Sorcerer to the Crown. Yes, like those. So there's like a lot of good, like historical fantasy that has a strong romantic component to it. And I tended to be like really attracted to that back in the day. But just for so long, my goal was reading kids' books. And I started out as a published author in the young adult space, writing kind of big epic fantasy. So for me, the thing that really kind of changed everything and changed what suddenly I wanted to write that I hadn't wanted to before was not in the fantasy space. It was in the romance space. Specifically, I read Christina Lauren's Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating, which is like one of the ultimate rom-coms. It's just so great. It's hysterical. And I was not a romance reader prior to reading that book. And then once I read it, I was off to the races, and that was like 2019, and then 2020 hit, and I was just gobbling up that kind of romance. And it occurred to me that I wanted to take that and stick it into a secondary world fantasy space. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like a slightly different way into the genre.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good point. I do think that with cozy fantasy, we're able to explore more like genres within cozy fantasy. Like we can put like a rom-com into a fantasy setting, we could probably put like a sports romance into a fantasy setting. Like we can kind of put like a thriller into a fantasy setting, but make it like kind of fun, like, you know, like Olivia was saying, where it's like you remove yourself from the thriller space or like the mystery of it, you know. And that's
Fantasy
really
nice.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, it's nice. Yeah, like you can really kind of play around with, like, I feel like even within our books, like we all have very different like subsects of cozy fantasy.
Yeah.
Like they're very different themes throughout, which is really cool.
I want to jump to one of the questions that we got because I think it kind of relates to something you've all been chatting about, but it's basically about if writing in the subgenre of like cozy fantasy allows you to focus on character development versus what you might need to focus on, for example, in a high fantasy or other fantasy where you might need to bring in more of like, for example, maybe plot or world or whatever. You know, how does the subgenre impact how you change focus or how you use all of these different things in your books?
Oh, okay. I have a soapbox on this one. So I've done some judging in self-published fantasy spaces. There's a whole like community around it, and I have noticed that a lot of people, when they read a fantasy novel, have a preconceived idea of what plot is. So like they'll read a cozy fantasy and they'll be like, there wasn't really a lot of plot in this book. And I'll go, by which metric though? Do we just assume that plot, period, only exists if it's a world-ending level thing? Like why is it considered less of a plot that we are dealing with individual problems? This is still, you can still have a plot that is a full character arc that is still important to the story, dealing with, you know, very small problems. And I think they're more relatable problems. And I've always said that when you're writing an epic fantasy, and I'm literally wrapping up editing on an epic fantasy right now, one of the problems that comes up with characterization is the fact that the stakes are so huge that you get a distorted idea of who the characters are, because we are very different people when the world is ending as opposed to our everyday lives. And some people who you would love to know and interact with on a daily basis, you would not want to associate with when the world is ending, and vice versa. It's completely different set of problems. And you just, I don't know, I feel like it's very easy in an epic fantasy to completely lose sight of who the characters are at any other time of their lives. You have no idea what they're like on a daily basis because the world is ending. You don't have time for that. Like, it just distorts everything. So that's a pet peeve of mine, is people being like, you know, cozy fantasy doesn't have as much plot. And I'm like, no, it's just a different kind of plot.
Well,
you may not like that plot, but it is still plot.
What's kind of interesting to me about the plot, that idea of that, I feel like that's a very Western mindset. Like, the Western world has been trained to look for that 3-act structure. You know, like, we've been trained to look for that type of plot. Whereas if you go to more Eastern cultures, you might end up seeing more slice of life stories. You know, like, you think of like a Japanese anime, and like, you know, how many episodes do they have where they're just going to school? You know, right? Like, there's not really big, like, they have those big arcing problems that show up every once in a while, and then there's all those episodes in the middle that are just slice of life. You know, like, maybe they have a picnic one day, and that's a plot too. You know, so I do think that mindset of like, you know, cozy fantasy doesn't have a plot. I think it's because cozy fantasy is leaning towards more of those slice of life in certain stories. And that is very weird for a lot of Western audiences. Like, they might not have seen that in many instances in a novel before. Maybe.
There's also there is a fundamental, I think, conflation of plot and pacing. And so a lot of the time, what is a slower paced book, and often cozy fantasy is slower paced by nature, people will assume that means that there is a lack of plot. But they're two different things. And, you know, like, you know, Rebecca, like you said, the Western mindset is look for that 3-act structure, but also pace, pace, pace. Like,
and
let's
amp
do
up the stakes every chance you get. Like if
And
there's
thing
a
is, like,
sentence that
I
isn't
get that
bringing more
sometimes.
drama.
I have
Mhm.
ADHD. Sometimes I want to just get to the point.
Yeah.
But sometimes, and like I grew up with a lot of Indian epics, and these are huge, massive mythological epics spanning sort of centuries and
Yeah.
hundreds of characters and thousands upon thousands of pages, like translated. And but even within all of that, it is astonishing how much of it is slice of life, how much of it is
Mhm.
food and what's happening and a custom and a religious festival and
Yeah.
just a random conversation with a cow. It's just like it boggles the brain of anybody who's been trained to only look for a very specific kind of story.
Right.
And yeah, I think that is also one of the things I love so much about cozy fantasy is that we, in this Western space, get to push those boundaries a little bit and
Right.
retrain our own brains a bit as well.
Yeah.
I think that's such a brilliant insight, because something that I've noticed as well is I agree with the pacing, and I agree with this, Western idea that plot has to constantly be moving. But I've also noticed too that this advice, which gets thrown around a lot, which the show don't tell advice for any sort of writing. I'm not saying it doesn't have a place in cozy, but I am Latin, I'm Latina. I write very lyrically, I suppose. Like my sentences are longer than most Western or not Western American type books, and I understand the appeal of show don't tell, but there's a lot of my culture that is told. Like it is told. My book is like I said, a reimagined Incan empire. The Incas never had a written language. All our storytelling is oral. It's oral traditions passed down. And I feel like that is probably one of the largest criticisms of my young adult series, is that there's too much description. There's too much description in this book. While when I did it in the cozy, however, people loved it. It's so beautiful. It's so descriptive. It's so, I feel like I'm in the world. And so there was more of an allowance. Like there was, I had a pass to do that in this one versus my young adult, like high fantasy series, which I found really interesting. But I think that everything that we're talking about sort of meshes in that idea as well.
I do also sometimes feel like when you're writing in this space, like all of us here are writing for primarily a Western audience. We're writing in English for British and American audiences and, sort of European audiences. And that's the market. And so sometimes the things that we can't show, if we tried to show you things, they would take, several books to sort of get to the point. So sometimes we have to tell the audience things, because that's how you get to the good stuff, or rather what they would call the good stuff is sort of, and it is a different kind of storytelling. And again, the great thing about cozy fantasy is that we're allowing ourselves this different kind of storytelling.
Yeah. It really is kind of like the perfect segue for an American audience to start to learn about things. And I think that's where like my next question with like my next thing that I want to see with cozy is more diverse cozy. Because I feel like we're getting a lot of white cozy that I'm just like, please. and I know this summer coming down the pipeline, I'm just kind of waiting for it. Like I want more Latin American cozy. I want more, Japanese cozy. I want more Indian cozy. Like I want more of like the cultures that are not what I'm normally used to seeing. So Megan.
I don't know. Like everyone sounds smart. I'm like, what am I adding to this? I don't know.
Keep putting her on the spot.
Well, no, I think for me, like, I actually don't think the genre changes my approach to writing. And I think for me, it's no matter what I do, it's always character driven. So my first two books are big epic tragedies in fantasy settings, but they're very character driven. And obviously, if I'm writing romantic comedy in a bonkers fantasy setting, that's going to be really character driven. And because, I mean, the reason I read is because I want to experience, like, I want the human experience, and I want to feel the entire range of emotions. So when I write, I want people to feel. Right? That's like my whole thing. And one thing I get frustrated with in traditional fantasy is that it feels like everything gets so focused on world building and also plot that you don't get to spend as much time. I mean, this has already come up in the conversation. You don't get to know those characters as much. So even in my first two books, like, yeah, they're fantasy and there's this big epic world, but it's really hyper focused on like 2 or 3 people and who they are and how they grow, you know, and because I care a lot more about that than I do about the setting or the world. Right. Like, to me, the world is like, if you're doing a play, the world is the set, and the audience shouldn't be really paying attention to the set. Like, the set should give you just enough information to make you be able to
add context.
Yeah, and willingly suspend your disbelief
right.
in order to follow these characters. And that's just the same thing I brought with me into Cozy. And when I was writing it, while hiding from my children in a global pandemic in my house, like, I wasn't like, deliberately thinking I am writing a cozy fantasy, because no one was using those words in 2020, right? It was like, well, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I don't know if my career is going anywhere. I'm going to write something that brings me joy and do all the things that I want in a book. And it turns out that was something called cozy fantasy.
Yeah.
I remember calling it like soft fantasy, like to myself when I was working on it, because that's what I wanted. I wanted soft. I'd just come out of doing a YA trilogy that was intense and like dark and angsty, which I still love it. But at the time, I mean, it was 2020. I did not want angsty and dark. I had enough of that.
Yeah.
I was living that. And so I remember just thinking of it as like pitching it to my agent as just this sort of softer fantasy, just like a bit quieter. And, you know, like I hesitated with that word because we all know that quiet is usually like a death knell for a book. But yeah, because we weren't using that word then. We weren't using the term cozy fantasy, even though we were sometimes saying, yes, it feels cozy and the vibes are cozy. But yeah, then it just sort of happened. Yeah, soft was my word.
I like that. Soft fantasy.
I do like that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what I would think of when I'm listening to everyone speak here as well, is that sometimes I think, and this is not only fantasy, right? High fantasy, but I think sometimes both with world and with plot, if you don't have an emotional connection about why a character acts in a way that is against what what they say that they won't do, basically, then there's no stakes. You feel like, okay, you've done this, but like, why? I guess we're just go on. And so I feel like with cozy fantasy, so much of it is delving into as well, like the why behind it, to have that have a more emotional impact, like they care about it kind of being this like resounding clang instead of the next thing to propel the plot, I guess, if I had to say that too.
Yeah.
And also with world building as well, right? My biggest pet peeve is like when you have a set of rules about a world and then something's broken within that set and everyone's just like, wow, it's broken, but without having that deep connection to the characters, how they feel about the world, then you're kind of like, oh, I guess rules get broken all the time. Like, great.
Yeah.
Move on. What's next?
Right.
The next question I have is kind of something that you all were chatting a little bit about, but everyone has kind of written other genres, other projects, other books, other kind of, things and series and stories. And I wanted to know, based on that, how this project, specifically the books we're talking about today, how that experience and that writing process changed, or if it changed based on other projects. And specifically, Sangu, you were talking about this one being a departure from the Celestial Sci-Fi Space trilogy.
Oh boy, was it.
But yeah, and it's also a departure from other of your work. So from everyone, I'd love to hear about how maybe approaching this project was different and what kind of opportunities you're excited for, based on maybe the other things you've written before.
I will actually go first so that I
So
just get it out of the way.
Get it out of the way. Yeah, I was about to
Uh,
say.
you know, I think what's funny is over time, like my approach to how I write has really changed. And like my first two books, I think I learned what my approach needs to be, like by learning the hard way. And like Sunggu, I came off writing like a really big, epic, deep, dark epic fantasy kind of thing. That was a word salad. I wrote this big, dark fantasy that was tragic, and it took it out of me. And so when I started writing this cozy fantasy stuff, like that was kind of partially a reaction to it. But also when I was writing that book, like my editor took me through this process where it wasn't working. And so we just kind of we rewrote the first act, and then we rewrote like the first half. You know what I mean? And we kept like going back and rewriting until we had the setup correct. And I learned that worked really well for me, right? And so I've kind of gotten to the point now where when I'm approaching a new project, I just rewrite that first act over and over and over again until I'm like, this is it. This is right. Because I think the beginning is the hardest. And anytime you're writing like a big full-length project and you get down the road and you're like, this is not working, inevitably you mess something up in the setup. There's something wrong in the setup. And you have to go all the way back. And so for me, I've learned along the way, especially having written a big YA fantasy epic, that the best approach for me is to just really focus on act one. And if I do that, the rest of the book really falls into place really quickly. And by the time I hand in a draft to my editor, it's more like most people's draft 3. You know what I'm saying? Because the front half is really polished, and then the rest of it just makes sense. And it's more a matter of tweaking or like moving a few things around.
Yeah.
So there, I've answered the question.
Thanks, Dawn, I loved it. You have a lot of good things to say.
I think for me, so I wrote 2 books of a series that will be 4 books. And it was a YA high fantasy sort of thing. It is a YA high fantasy sort of thing. And after book 2, I really should have gone straight into book 3, but I was a little burnt out by it. Also, self-publishing, you write the book and then you have to market it and publish. And that's true in traditional publishing too. But there's a lot of steps with self-publishing, and I just was so burnt out. And I said, I'm going to just switch gears. Because I did want to write, I got into the habit of writing, every day and sitting down, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to give the third book the justice it deserved. So I thought, let me switch gears. I'll write something else. Maybe I'll do like a contemporary rom-com. I don't know. Turns out I'm not suited for contemporary. It has to be fantasy. And what I found really different about being able to write the cozy was that, in my YA series, it's an inventive Latin American world. I'm Peruvian and Cuban, and I grew up in Guatemala. So it's kind of a mix and blend of all my culture and experience into that book. Versus this one, where I very specifically wanted to base it off of a Peruvian myth that I learned growing up. Like my mother would tell us a lot of Peruvian stories. And so it was, to me, it felt very self-indulgent to be able to write something and base it fully on like my own cultural background and experience. And it was very different because the type of research I did was very different from what I did in my YA. In YA, I could make up things within the bounds of like this inventive Latin world. But in this book, I really had to make sure that it was Peruvian to the core. And it was a lot of trial and error. And like I said, that we didn't have a written language. So it was a lot of just like hearing stories from people and seeing how they matched up or didn't, and realizing that in the end, whatever stories that I was told as a child were valid. Like it doesn't need to be substantiated by any sort of like Wikipedia article or anything like that, because that's how oral tradition works. And so I felt like this was, I don't know why self-indulgent just keeps coming up. Like I felt like it was very much just, I was able to pour a part of myself into this book, and share a slice of my culture with people who might not have known about it otherwise. I I haven't seen a lot of Peruvian mythology out there, like books based on Peruvian mythology. So that was what was really special for me writing Asiri and the Amaru.
I love that.
I think it's funny you should bring up like kind of the self-indulgent aspect. I think that's also something I learned from the Regency fairy tales, is because I was originally in self-publishing with I had a friend, and we had gotten together mostly for fun, and we were co-writing these paranormal romances. I will not tell you the titles. And I sat down at one point and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to write under a different pen name. I'm going to write something that I would want to read, not at all to market, as far as I know. And we'll just see what happens. I'll publish it for fun. And then that turned out being like my most successful book. That was Half a Soul. And the things that I enjoyed about Half a Soul were things I thought no one else would enjoy. And they were things like, yes, I'm writing a Regency novel that is very explicitly calling out the fact that the aristocracy is stupid, actually. They're very bad. We shouldn't have them. Rich people are awful. And like, I basically, like, yes, there were a few staples of the genre, but I basically satirized a Regency romance and said, actually, I would never want to date any of these people. They're just awful. And and apparently people enjoyed it.
Oh yeah. Can I tell you, Olivia, I was at a bookish retreat, I believe in January, with like these 7 amazing women on TikTok and Book Talk and BookTube and all of this. And we always bring a bunch of books and we share our TBRs and everything. And Lizzie, who's Bumblebees on TikTok, she had your book, and the entire weekend she kept giggling and like literally kicking her feet. We'd be reading and she'd be like giggling, and every single one of us switched our TBR to include your book instead, because we're like, we need to know why Lizzie keeps like behind her hands, like. And yeah, we had such a great time with it. So yeah, people definitely love it.
I'm not on camera, but I'm blushing. Thank you.
I think for me with Cozy Fantasy, when I was first starting, like I had a really editor, like I left my agent to go and write Treason, to self-publish it back in 2022. And I had my agent, my last agent was a very editorial heavy agent, which works for a lot of people. But I was starting to feel like after 4 years, she was kind of just nitpicking based on what she wanted to read rather than what I was interested in writing. So I would get a lot of feedback from her that was like, amp up the stakes here, you know, like she'd highlight paragraphs and be like, what can we do to make this more dramatic, you know? And like, I feel like I had 4 years of that kind of feedback. So when I pivoted into Cozy, you know, it was partially because I wanted to learn the process of self-publishing so I could teach it later, but also because I wanted something that was for me and not something that would go through her eyes, you know, like not something that would go through any agent's eyes. Like it didn't matter what they thought. I wasn't going to query it, you know? So it was very rewarding for me. Like you said, self-indulgent. Like, I think that is really the word for Cozy. Like I was writing this book because I wanted to self-publish and I wanted the experience of self-publishing. And I felt like there would have been, I felt like there was going to be a market for it looking forward. But I also, it was so nice to not have to amp up the stakes on every page. You know, like I could write a scene and be like, how can I amp up? I'm like, it doesn't matter. I don't need to amp up. Like I could just go back and they're going to have a cup of tea and that's lovely. You know, I liked that.
I feel like for me, this is probably a really boring answer, actually, but I feel like what I've discovered about myself as a writer is that regardless of what I'm writing, I am heavily influenced by what's happening around me. I cannot just, I mean, I could as a teenager, but as an adult, I cannot just sort of hole up and just vanish into my own world anymore. And I feel like the way I wrote when I was 20, sort of 14-hour days, just because it was fun, just sort of like leaning hard into it, didn't get tired, is very different from the way I write now that I'm 35. I'm tired. I have children. That's changed the way I sort of manage my time. It's changed the way I write. It's changed, and also, I mean, I think fundamentally writing professionally is so different from writing just for fun.
Mhm.
And that changes the process as well, because I mean, I love so much that you've all recently had that more self-indulgent experience, but I feel like, seeing as I've always been traditional, I've always, since my first book, which was in 2012, so 11 years ago, nope, 12 years ago. How is it so long? I can't maths anymore. But yeah, I feel like it is always in the back of my head that I am thinking about the market. I'm thinking about, will it sell? I'm thinking about, can I pay my rent or my mortgage or whichever one it was at the time? And like, I think COVID is the most obvious example of like an external thing that completely changed my writing process.
Mhm.
But it's also the little things and the big things. Kids, another big one, like mental health.
Mhm.
I've had, I mean, the last year has been my worst sort of mental health sort of low. I had COVID for the third time in December and still have long COVID. I'm tired all the time. I don't do 14-hour days anymore. I can't. I feel like fundamental. Like you could put me in a cave with like cold drinks and Wi-Fi, and I still wouldn't be able to do it because I cannot function that way anymore. And I think health just impacts the way I write. And so it's like, it's a bit of a boring sort of darker answer, but yeah, I just feel like my writing process is just heavily influenced at every turn by what is going on in my day-to-day existence, and largely in the last few years by health.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Speaking of TBRs, I wanted to end today's panel by asking you all, what has been a book that has been on your TBR the longest? I don't know. That's a tricky question because I was thinking about what's been on my TBR the longest. But I'm only asking the questions. So.
I have an answer to this. So there's a cursed book on my TBR, and I feel so bad about it. So I got sent a book to blurb. Like my editor sent me this book, and she was like, "This is so up your alley. You're gonna love this. You need to read this." And I was like, "Yeah, it sounds great, and it sounds right up my alley, and I would love to read it. Can you send me a physical copy?" And she was like, "Sure, absolutely." It got lost in the mail twice. And by the time it finally showed up, the book was already out. I could not blurb it anymore. And I became superstitious about it. I don't know why. My brain just will not let me take it off the shelf and read it now, because it's like, no, I was not meant to ever read this book that is so obviously something that I would enjoy. And I can't, someday I'm going to read this book. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to close all the doors, I'm going to get rid of the cats, I'm going to be like, okay, I have to read this book. And it is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which everybody with an ounce of awareness is like, that's Olivia's book. And I'm like, I know I should read it. I want to read it. But the universe made certain that I could not read it. And now that I have it, for some reason, I can't crack it open. It's staring at me from the shelf.
I knew that's what you were teeing up, because you and I talked about this like on the side. I'm like, God, I love this book. Have you read this? And you're like, no.
And I don't know why.
They're both great. I love that series.
I desperately want to read it. Why haven't I read it, Megan?
I don't know, but you should maybe fix that.
It happens though.
I know I'm supposed to look. Yeah, they're even saying it in comments. I'm like, I know.
Oh, mine's Cloud Atlas. Like,
Okay.
yeah, I know, right? Because that's been on my TBR since it probably came out.
Mhm.
And I don't know why I haven't read it. People say great things about it. Somebody whose taste is very similar to mine with books absolutely loves it. But I'm also a real mood reader, and I feel like it's an undertaking. And right now, well, actually, I suppose for the last 10 years, I haven't been in the mood for an undertaking. But yeah, that's my longest, I think.
I think for me, I want in theory to be a long, true, epic, cozy, or epic fantasy reader, just like in general. Like I want to read those epics, the ones that everybody like makes all of who they are, right? Like, so I think, but I'm not, like, I'm also ADHD to the max and like avoidant as hell. So I'm just like, no, that's a commitment. I don't really want to do that, you know? Like, so I think for mine, it's probably either any of Brandon Sanderson's series, because like my partner is like obsessed with him, and I'm just like, I will get there someday. Lord of the Rings, and probably Priory of the Orange Tree. Like all of these massive epics that I know I would love if I
bet you would love Priory so much.
But like,
I was
they're
gonna
so
say
big.
Priory is mine, and I do love those long epics. Like I love a like 6-book chunky series, you know. I dive right into those worlds, but for some reason Priory has been sitting on my shelf for far too long.
Yeah, no, same. It's just, it has like a space of honor, and I feel guilty every day I look at it. I'm just like,
I think so I turned 50 this year, and I think there are probably things hanging out on my TBR for like 30 years. I mean, I couldn't even tell you. So I saw this question. I'm like, I don't know. I'm gonna come. So I'll just cough up a title that's been hanging out for a long time, and I'm sure I'm gonna like it. I haven't gotten to it. It's Winter's Orbit, and I think it's because it's sci-fi, and I really have to be like in a sci-fi mood. I like sci-fi, but I don't necessarily. That's not usually my go-to. And so I think I just have to I've got to be in the sci-fi mood.
I never
like Googling what that cover looks like.
I never remember if I read that one or Ocean's Echo or whatever. There's two.
Right.
Yes. One of them, and it was so good.
This is what I'm saying. Everyone says this. I need to read it.
What's actually funny to me is that I can't do
communication trope that I love. I love it. I adore it. They're so dumb and they're perfect.
I don't know what it is, but for some reason I can't do epic fantasies, but I have no problem with space operas, like long epic sci-fi. I have no problem with. Like I'll dive into those and I'll read them like I'm consuming them like butter. You know, it's just like, yes, all the carbs.
Okay, sci-fi or space fantasy? Because like
sci-fi,
okay.
like I want like on a spaceship traveling to other planets with no real magic or anything. Like I want like science, like technology.
Got it.
And I don't know why that's easy for me to read when like epic fantasies are so, I don't know. So I literally just like Google, I was like Winter's Orbit, and I just like opened it up and I'm like, yes, I'm buying that today.
Yeah, I also saw the question after I wrote it, and I was like, wow, that was an interesting one. You actually, Megan, you though said mine. I have not read Jonathan Strange.
Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
And it's because someone told me about it, and I was like, oh, I'm really interested in it. Okay, I'll pick it up. And I saw it at a used book sale, and I picked it up, and it is chunky.
It's chunky.
Like, I'm using it kind of as like something to hold down for weight on things like on book jackets, you know, that need to be flattened out again. That's primarily what it does in my house, because I was like, no one told me that it was going to be this big when they recommended it. Like, how can that be?
It's one of those where like once you're in and you're like so immersed in it, you don't even think about it. You just keep reading.
I love Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for a very specific reason. And that reason is I get the impression that Susanna Clarke has the same love-hate relationship with classics that I do, because I hate classics. I have read so many of them. I've been forced to read so many of them, and I loathe them, but I know too much about them. And that is the sort of book I would write if I ever wanted to lampoon classics.
I always hate that classics mean like white American, usually authors. Like who decided that these were the classics?
And a lot of classics are poorly crafted. They're not that good. And like they just got there first. And so we read them and we're like, yes, this is a classic. And I'm like, yes, it's a classic because it's not refined. It's somebody wrote it first, and then we figured out how to do it better, and we should never read it again.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be very controversial, I imagine. But I find Lord of the Rings so boring. so boring. Like
Thank you. I am there with you.
I
Like my
die a
poor
little bit
fiance
inside.
has been trying to get me to watch.
I've
She's like,
tried
"Just
so
watch
many
the
times.
movies."
I watched the movies.
I will.
I tolerated the movies.
Like
but
yeah, like they're. She's
I
gonna hear me upstairs and say something.
I absolutely adore the movies. Like I rewatch them once a year at least, usually around my birthday. I absolutely love them. The books I found very slow. I liked The Hobbit better than The Lord
The
of the
Hobbit, I read. Yeah, no,
I have
the
heard
Hobbit I read,
a
and
lot of
that
people
was,
say that The Hobbit
Mhm.
feels more cozy fantasy
Yeah.
adjacent.
yeah, no, The Hobbit
And-
was really good. I enjoyed that.
Whereas I feel like Lord of the Rings wants to do epic and also wants to do cozy, but can't decide, and then
Hmm.
got more interested in language somewhere along the way and something else.
Yeah.
I didn't get far enough to know beyond that.
You know what got me through Lord of the Rings was that I read it right after I finished a master's degree in English, and I took classes in philology, and like that's what Tolkien was known for, like
Yeah.
as an academic, right? And like,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and so it was funny because I was reading those, and I didn't necessarily get into plot or character, but like all the stuff he was doing with Old English poetry and comitatus and like all the Anglo-Saxon stuff,
Mhm.
and I was like, I actually know something about this. And
That
I think
makes
that's what got me
Yeah.
through that series.
I cannot be unbiased on the subject of Lord of the Rings because my mother read them to me. So
Aw.
it's one of those like
Aw.
I have no idea how good or bad they are apart from
Yeah.
that. I just remember like sitting in a tent because we went camping and it's storming outside and my mother is reading, you know, the latest chapter of The Two Towers to us. And
That's really cute.
It's
I
really
love that.
sweet.
That's really cute. Yeah. Sengu, we never got your TBR.
Didn't I say Cloud Atlas? Did I say Cloud Atlas?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Oh, you
Got it.
did. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, you're right.
What?
You're totally
I
right.
couldn't remember either, to be honest. It could have been anything. Like my brain does not brain.
Well, clearly, I need another cup of. I need to catch up, to Olivia with that half cup of coffee because I'm like,
I'm on 2 now. You got to catch up.
oh
Ooh.
man.
Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us all. Thank you to the lovely authors and panelists. Thank you as well to everyone in the comment who've all agreed as well that Jonathan Strange is very long. And seeing it in audio form and the amount of hours did not necessarily make me feel differently about how long it looks like it's going to be. But I will tentatively maybe bump it up like 10 or so spots on the TBR. I've left everyone's links to their books in the description box below, so please go pick them up and add them to your TBR and do all the amazing things for them. And I want to thank everyone as well for watching and for having this amazing conversation, which I'm sure we could continue for like 5 more hours today. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day, however long you have of it.
Oh, Lily, thank you so